The air inside the neutral medical station always felt heavy to Ryan, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of the war that had raged only months before it was meant to be a place where both humans and the alien race called Velari could work side by side, treating the wounded from both sides. But for Ryan it was nothing more than a daily reminder that peace was only written on paper and not in the hearts of the people here. He had been a soldier for most of his adult life, fighting on countless battlefields, seeing friends and comrades fall before his eyes, and more often than not, those deaths came at the hands of the Velari. Their sleek ships, their energy weapons, their cold alien efficiency burned into his memory. So when he was assigned to serve as security detail and occasional field medic, here he took the job with clenched teeth and a heart full of distrust. The first time he saw Allura, she was standing near the medbay's entrance arranging supplies in a tall cabinet, her movements precise, almost too precise, like every gesture was measured and calculated. She was tall for a Velari, her skin a pale shade, with faint silver patterns across her cheeks and down her neck markings that shifted slightly under the light. Her eyes were a deep violet, and when they met his for the first time they held no warmth. She did not greet him. She simply glanced at him for a moment, before returning to her work as if he were just another piece of the station's furniture. And that in itself made his blood warm with irritation. From that day forward, they spoke only when duty demanded it. And even then their voices carried no kindness. When Ryan brought in a wounded human soldier from a skirmish near the asteroid belt, Allura treated the injury with care, but her tone with him was clipped. When she needed him to move equipment, she would say it plainly without a hint of thanks, and when he asked her for status updates on human patients, she gave the bare minimum, as if the exchange of words was an effort she would rather avoid. It was not just personal dislike, it was deeper than that. It was as if every breath they shared in the same room was filled with the echo of the war, each one seeing the other as a symbol of what they had lost. And the strange thing was, neither of them hid it. Ryan did not pretend to be polite, and Allura did not pretend to want his company. The other staff noticed, of course. The human nurses sometimes joked about the icy air when the two of them were in the same room. The Velari medics gave each other small looks and shook their heads. One evening after a long shift, Ryan walked into the medbay carrying a crate of portable Medi-gel units, his arms aching from the weight. He set them down near the counter and saw Allura working at one of the diagnostic tables. She was repairing a handheld scanner, its casing open, revealing a network of delicate circuits. He tried to pass without speaking, but she looked up, and for a moment their eyes met again, and he remembered a battlefield months ago, remembered running through smoke carrying his friend Tomas on his back, the sound of Velari energy fire cutting through the air, and Tomas's blood warm against his uniform. That memory came to him so sharply that his jaw tightened. Allura's gaze did not change, but he wondered what memory flashed in her mind when she looked at him. Their cold relationship might have continued in that same way, if not for what happened a few days later. There had been a distress call from a mining outpost in a nearby asteroid field. A small explosion had injured several workers, both human and Velari, and the station dispatched a small team. As part of the security escort, Allura came along as the lead medic. The journey to the outpost was quiet. No one spoke much, and when they arrived the place smelled of scorched metal, and Ryan helped carry the injured to the shuttle. He noticed that Allura treated the wounded of both species with equal focus, never hesitating in her work, but she still barely looked his way, as if the space between them was filled with an invisible wall. When most of the injured were stable, Ryan thought the mission was over, but then a loud creak echoed through the outpost structure. A section of the ceiling collapsed without warning. Debris fell, and a shard of jagged metal tore through his shoulder. Pain hit him hard, the shock making his knees weaken. He heard shouting, saw blurred shapes around him, and then Allura's face came into view. She was saying something to one of the other medics, her voice firm and urgent. Before turning back to him, she told him to stay still, her hands moving quickly to stop the bleeding. Ryan wanted to argue, wanted to tell her not to touch him, But the pain was too strong, and before he could say anything, she called for the portable stretcher and ordered him to be taken back to the shuttle. He remembered little of the trip back to the station, just the cold of the medbay and Lura's voice giving instructions as they prepared the healing pod. The pod was advanced tech combining both human regenerative methods and Valari biocrystal systems. It could mend torn flesh and knit bone within hours. Ryan had been in one before, but never under the care of someone he distrusted so deeply. As they prepared him to enter the pod, he thought about asking for another medic, but the words never left his mouth. As the chamber door closed around him, he caught one last glimpse of her standing at the control panel, her expression unreadable. He felt the strange mix of tension and exhaustion pull him toward unconsciousness, and the last thought in his mind was that he did not want to owe her anything. Not even his life, but fate had other plans, and the pod would soon do far more than heal his wound. It would change everything he thought he knew about her, and about himself. Ryan lay inside the smooth oval chamber of the healing pod, feeling the gentle hum of the systems around him. The walls glowed with a faint blue light, and thin strands of energy moved like veins across the surface. The sensation was strange, not exactly painful, but deep enough to make him feel every pulse in his body. The medbay was quiet except for the soft whir of machines. Lura stood outside at the console, her long fingers moving over the controls. She did not look at him much, instead watching the readings with that same calm precision she always carried. But Ryan could not ignore the way her presence filled the space. Even through the glass, he could feel the weight of her attention. He had been in healing pods before, and normally it was a simple process. The tech would scan the injury, flood the damaged area with a mix of regenerative gel and biocrystals, then accelerate tissue repair while the patient rested. But this pod was one of the newest models, a hybrid design built by both human and Valari engineers. Its systems were faster, more complex, and in some ways unpredictable. The station had received it only weeks ago, and most of the staff had barely tested it in real scenarios. As the cycle began, Ryan closed his eyes, letting the warmth spread through his arm and shoulder. The pain dulled slowly, replaced by a heavy tiredness. He was on the edge of sleep when a sudden vibration shook the chamber, faint at first, then stronger. Lura's head turned sharply toward the ceiling. The overhead lights flickered once, twice before going dim. The hum of the pod rose in pitch like a coil being wound too tight. The air smelled faintly of ozone, a sure sign that the power systems were struggling somewhere far beyond the medbay. A deep low boom echoed through the station. The solar storm had been predicted earlier that day, but no one expected it to hit so soon. Ryan felt the pod shudder again, the inner lights shifting from blue to a warning amber. Lura spoke quickly into her com, calling for engineering, but before she could finish, the link cut out with a sharp static burst. She cursed it under her breath in her own language, words Ryan did not understand, but the tone needed no translation. Pod's transparent door began to slide open, but halfway it froze and locked in place. Ryan tried to sit up, but a sudden wave of dizziness hit him, and he slumped back. Lura tapped a sequence on the console, her movements faster now as she switched to manual override. But the system flashed red and sealed itself again in an emergency lockdown. He realized too late that this was not just a malfunction, it was something worse. The hybrid tech had a safeguard mode that trapped anyone inside until the internal cycle was safe to interrupt. Lura hesitated only for a moment before making a decision. She moved to the secondary chamber on the other side of the pod. This model had twin compartments meant for simultaneous treatment of two patients. She stepped inside, quickly telling one of the assistants to lock it. The idea was to enter the maintenance channel that ran between the two compartments, allowing manual disconnection from within. But as soon as she crossed the threshold, the storm's power surge hit the station again. The pod systems glitched in an instant. Both compartments sealed themselves, and the internal field that was meant to treat injuries instead extended into the neural interface. Ryan felt at first like a strange ripple through his thoughts. His vision blurred, even though his eyes were closed, and then came a flood of sensations not his own. He could feel the weight of someone else's breathing, the faint thrum of a second heartbeat not far from his own, and a wave of emotions that did not belong to him. Confusion, frustration, and something sharper like the edge of a hidden wound. He opened his eyes and saw the faint outline of Lura through the dividing wall, though they were in separate chambers. It felt as if no barrier existed at all. She must have felt it too, because her head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing as if trying to understand what had just happened. He tried to speak, but no sound came instead. A thought drifted into his mind, not formed in his own voice, but in hers. It was not words. Exactly, more like a memory of her walking down a corridor long ago, the air heavy with smoke, her arms carrying a limp form, a Valari child with fading silver patterns across the skin. A deep ache filled Ryan's chest before he realized it was not his pain. The pod was linking them, the regenerative neural sync that was normally used to read a patient's pain signals was crossing between the two compartments, merging human and Valari pathways into a single current. It was not meant to do this, yet the storm had forced the systems into a state no one had prepared for. Ryan's own memories began to slip outward like water through an open gate. He could feel them reaching her, the chaos of battlefields, the desperate grip of his friend Thomas as he bled out, the pounding rush of running through fire, the moment of helplessness when he knew Thomas was gone. The emotions were raw and unshielded, and he hated that she could feel them, as if some part of him had been stripped bare. But he also saw the shift in her eyes, not pity, but recognition. They stayed like that for minutes or hours. Ryan could not tell. Time seemed to bend inside the pod, each memory dragging up another, each emotion brushing against the other's mind like fragile glass. They did not speak with voices, yet whole conversations passed between them. Small pieces of understanding threading into the spaces where only hatred had lived before. Outside, the medbay technicians worked frantically to restore power and free the trapped pod, but inside, Ryan and Lura were locked in a silent exchange. Neither of them could have imagined when the day began. He had thought of her only as the enemy in different skins. She had likely thought the same of him, but now the boundaries blurred their minds, brushing against the truths they had never wanted to share. And somewhere deep beneath the layers of resentment, a question began to grow in Ryan's mind. If he could feel her pain so clearly, if she could see his memories as if they were her own, could either of them truly go back to hating each other? When the pod finally opened, the storm outside the station still raged, sending faint tremors through the walls of the medbay, and each tremor made the pod's inner lights flicker. Ryan could feel the strange link between him and Lura growing stronger instead of fading. It was as if the more the system tried to repair itself, the deeper their minds sank into each other's worlds. He no longer saw her only as a shape beyond the glass. Now she was inside his thoughts as much as he was inside hers. A new wave of memory rose in his mind, but it was not his. It came from her. It began in a place he had never seen, a wide-open plain under a deep orange sky where the air shimmered with heat. A group of Valari were running across the flat ground, their skin catching the light in silver streaks, and among them was Lura, younger, her face sharper with youth, laughter bright in her eyes. And then the sound came, the sharp whine of incoming fire. The horizon flared with light, the ground shook, and in an instant, the laughter was gone. A cloud of dust and heat rolled across the plain, and Ryan felt the terror and helplessness crush into his chest as she fell to her knees over the body of a smaller Valari, whose markings had already begun to fade. Ryan gasped as if the air had been taken from him, but the image did not fade. It stayed there, deep and heavy, until he understood that this moment had burned itself into her, just as the death of Tomas had burned itself into him. And for the first time he saw her, not as the medic who ignored him, not as the alien who stood on the other side of a war, but as someone who had lost something they could never get back. She was feeling his memories too. He could sense it. The way her eyes softened slightly, as if she finally understood why his voice always carried that edge. When speaking to her, she saw him carrying Tomas through the burning wreckage. She saw the way his hands trembled as he tried to stop the bleeding and the emptiness in his chest. When the stillness came over his friend, she saw the endless string of moments after that one, where each breath was heavier than the last, and no battlefield victory ever filled the hole left behind. For a while they did not try to block the flow. The pod kept pulling fragments from each of them, scenes from childhood, from training, from the war, from the lonely hours after it. Some were small things like the way Lura's people sang low and steady when they worked together in the medbay, or the way Ryan kept a piece of old cloth from his home colony folded in his pocket for luck. These things seemed meaningless alone, but together they built a shape, a fuller picture of each other than either could have imagined. They began to speak out loud, not because they needed to, but because it gave shape to the feelings now moving between them. Ryan asked about the silver patterns on her skin, and she told him they shifted with health and emotion, a living reflection of her body's state. Lura asked why humans carried physical mementos instead of digital ones, and he told her it was about the weight of a thing that had been touched by someone you loved, not just a copy in a machine. These were questions they would never have dared to ask before, and now the answers came without hesitation. The hours stretched on the storm, making it impossible for engineering to fully restart the systems. They were told over the com to remain calm, that the malfunction was stable, but to Ryan and Lura, the time inside the pod was not just waiting, it was changing. Something fundamental. The hate was still there in places like a scar, but around it new shapes were forming, shapes of understanding, and maybe even something warmer, though neither wanted to name it yet. At one point the link pulled them into a memory that was not entirely hers, and not entirely his. It was a strange blend. Ryan was standing in the ruins of a battlefield, but the sky was that deep orange of Lura's homeworld. He could hear Tomas calling him, but the voice came from somewhere in the silver-marked hills, and when he ran toward it, he found Lura kneeling in the dust holding the smaller Valari from her own memory. Yet when she looked up at him, her eyes were human. This strange mixed vision left them both shaken, but also tied together by something they could not undo. The longer the link stayed, the more Ryan noticed details about her he had ignored before. The slight pause she took before answering a question, as if weighing the cost of truth, the way her hands never hesitated when someone's life was in danger, even if that life belonged to the other side. And she began to see in him a discipline that was not just military habit, but a way of keeping himself from falling apart completely. Each act of order in his movements was a shield against the chaos in his heart. When fatigue began to creep in, Ryan let his eyes close, and instead of the usual guarded silence, he felt Lura's presence like a quiet hum in the back of his thoughts, steady and watchful. It reminded him of nights long ago when his unit camped between battles, and someone always kept watch, not because they liked each other, but because they had to survive. Yet this time it was different. It was not duty holding that presence in his mind, it was choice. Neither knew how much longer the pod would keep them this way, but both felt the unspoken truth that when it ended they could not return to the cold distance they had before. Something had been broken in the wall between them, and in its place, something fragile and unfinished had begun to grow. They did not know if it could survive outside the pod, but in that moment, under the dim amber light, they were no longer enemies trapped together. They were two people holding pieces of each other's pain. And though neither said it, Ryan could feel the quiet shift in her thoughts, the smallest spark of trust forming against the backdrop of the storm. And for the first time since the war began, he wondered if the enemy he had hated for so long had been a shadow all along. The medbay lights had begun to return to their steady glow, and the hum of the pod shifted in tone, signaling that the storm outside was moving away. The engineers were speaking through the com again, their voices clearer, this time saying they would begin the final override to open the compartments. Ryan could feel the link between him and Lura starting to thin, as if invisible threads were slowly being pulled away. It was strange how much he had grown used to the constant hum of her presence in his thoughts, and now each fading trace left a quiet emptiness. Saw her watching him through the thin glass divider, her eyes still carrying that violet depth, but now they held something softer than before, a silent acknowledgement that neither of them could deny what had passed between them. They might not speak of it once the doors opened, but they would never forget it, he thought. About saying something, though, he did not even know where to begin, but before he could decide, the station's alarms began to wail, a low, urgent sound that vibrated through the walls. The cum crackled with a new voice, this one sharp and strained warning of an incoming pirate vessel closing fast on the station. No one had expected an attack during a solar storm, but the pirates had chosen their moment well when defenses were still recovering from the power surges. Ryan's instincts woke instantly, pushing aside every trace of tiredness. He knew that the medbay would be a target. The pirates would want medical supplies to sell on the black market, and they would take hostages without hesitation. Before the engineers could finish the pod release, the first impact shook the station hard enough to knock loose a tray of instruments from the counter. Lura braced herself inside her compartment. Ryan pressed his hands against the glass, ready to move as soon as the doors opened. Then a burst of static filled the cum, followed by the order to all available personnel to assist in defending critical sections. The medbay was one of them. A second impact rattled through the floor, and then the pod's door mechanism finally engaged with a hiss. Ryan stepped out quickly, his legs heavy from being still so long. Lura exited her side at almost the same moment, and for the first time since they had met, they moved toward each other without hesitation. She reached for a medpack while he pulled the sidearm from the locker near the wall. Their eyes met for a heartbeat, and in that single glance, a plan passed between them. Without a word, they left the medbay together, moving quickly through the corridor toward the sound of distant shouting. Ryan kept ahead, scanning each intersection while Lura followed, carrying both the medpack and a compact shock rifle. Her people preferred non-lethal weapons when possible, but he knew she would use whatever force was needed to protect the patients. The link between them had faded almost completely, yet their movements still matched, as if the echo of that connection remained guiding them. When they reached the junction near the storage bay, they found two pirates forcing the door open. The men were human, rough-faced, and armed with pulse carbines. Ryan acted without pause, firing twice to drop one, and sending the other scrambling for cover. The surviving pirate returned fire, but Lura had already slipped to the side, her movements precise and fast. The shock rifle hissed, and the man fell twitching to the ground. Unconscious, Ryan gave her a brief nod, and they pushed on. The closer they came to the main entrance, the louder the chaos grew. Voices shouting, boots pounding against metal, and the sharp cracks of weapons the station security was holding. But the pirates had numbers on their side. Ryan took position near a bulkhead, motioning for Lura to cover the opposite angle. Together, they pushed forward in short bursts, securing one section after another. It was not smooth. The pirates fought hard, and at one point a stray shot grazed Ryan's arm, sending a hot sting through him, but Lura was there instantly, pressing a sealant patch over the burn without slowing her aim. In those moments, Ryan saw the truth of what they had learned in the pod. Put to the test, she trusted him to cover her blind spots. He trusted her to keep him standing, and neither questioned the other's choices. The hate that once made every step near her feel heavier was gone, replaced by a shared urgency that was stronger than any old wound. They finally reached the outer corridor, where a group of pirates had barricaded themselves near the main hatch. The fighting here was harsher, with debris scattered across the floor, and the air filled with the sharp tang of overheated metal. Ryan signaled Lura to wait, then lobbed a stun charge over the barricade. The blast sent the pirates reeling, and in that instant both of them surged forward. Ryan's sidearm barked again, while Lura's shock rifle dropped too. More in quick succession. The rest fled toward the docked pirate vessel as the station's defensive guns roared to life outside. The pirates disengaged their ship, pulling away under heavy fire. Ryan leaned against the wall, catching his breath. Lura lowered her rifle, scanning the corridor for any sign of return fire. But it was over. The alarm shifted to a calmer tone, indicating the threat had passed. For a moment neither spoke. The sudden quiet after so much noise felt strange. Ryan finally straightened, walking toward her with a faint smirk that was more tired than amused. "You are not bad with that thing," he said, nodding toward her rifle. Lura met his gaze and replied in that same calm, steady tone, "And you are not as reckless as I thought." They stood there among the scattered debris, their words simple, but the meaning behind them layered with everything that had happened since the pod had trapped them. When they returned to the medbay, the staff was already tending to the few injured from the fight. Lura moved to help immediately. Ryan stayed by the door for a moment, watching her work. It was not the same as before. Something had shifted, and though he could not name it yet, he felt its weight, like the promise of something waiting to be discovered. The war between their peoples might still cast a shadow over the galaxy, but here on this station, in this moment, there was no war between them. And as the engineers finally shut down the healing pod for inspection, Ryan glanced at it one last time, thinking how strange it was that a single accident inside that machine had led to this moment. A moment where he could stand beside someone he once hated and feel not anger but respect, maybe even something more, though he would not say it out loud, not yet. The medbay had grown quieter in the hours after the pirate attack. The once urgent rush of footsteps and shouts had softened into the low, steady rhythm of recovery. Ryan sat on one of the benches near the wall, his arm wrapped in a fresh bandage, his body tired, but his mind restless. Across the room, Lura moved between beds, checking on patients, human and Valari alike, her hands steady, her expression calm. She spoke in a voice that carried both authority and reassurance. And each time she passed by him, she gave the smallest glance, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel that silent thread still connecting them. Outside the wide window, the stars drifted past slowly. The station had resumed its gentle rotation, and distant beacons blinked in the dark. Ryan let his gaze rest there for a while, thinking of the way things had been before the pod, before the storm, before he had looked into the mind of someone he thought could never be more than an enemy. It felt strange to realize how much could change in such a short span of time. Stranger still to admit to himself that the change felt right. When his turn for a full scan came, he rose and crossed to the diagnostic table. Lura was there, waiting, her equipment already set up. They did not speak at first. She adjusted the scanner, guiding him into position, her movements quiet and precise like always. But when her hand brushed his arm briefly to steady him, it was different. There was no stiffness, no deliberate distance. It was simply a touch without the wall between them. "You fought well," she said finally, her tone even but her eyes holding something warmer than he had seen before. Ryan gave a small shrug, trying not to let the weight of her words show too much. "You kept me in one piece," he replied, and for a moment they almost smiled, though neither quite let it reach their lips. They stood like that in a silence that was not cold anymore, but full of things unsaid. When the Faidua, in a silence that was Zindanle, and a silence that was not cold anymore, but full of things unsaid. When the cold scan was done and the results cleared, Ryan made his way to the exit of the medbay, but paused in the doorway, turning back to look at her. She was watching him openly now, no quick glances, no guarded looks, only a quiet, steady gaze. He felt the urge to say something that could carry all the moments they had shared inside the pod, all the fragments of each other's lives that had been exchanged, but the words would not come. Instead, he gave a short nod, a gesture that was simple yet certain. She returned it with the same quiet firmness, and in that small exchange, more was said than any speech could hold. Later, as the station's commander made rounds to thank those who had defended the medbay, Ryan found himself replaying the events over and over. The firefight, the way Lura had moved in sync with him without needing commands, the way her voice had cut through the noise to warn him in time, the way her hands had worked quickly to patch his wound. before he could even think of stopping. All of it had felt like the actions of a comrade, not an adversary, and he realized that was what she had become. When his shift ended, he walked the quiet corridors toward the observation deck, needing space to think. The stars stretched endlessly before him, cold and beautiful and unchanging, yet he knew he had changed. Out there somewhere the war still waited, its wounds deep and complicated, but here on this station, one thread of that war had been cut and tied into something new behind him. He heard the soft sound of footsteps and turned to find Lura approaching. She stopped beside him, looking out at the same stars, her hands resting lightly on the railing. No words passed between them for a long while. The silence was easy, not heavy, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost reflective. Perhaps the pod healed more than we expected, she said. Ryan let out a slow breath and nodded. Maybe it was not the pod, maybe it was seeing what we both lost. Her head tilted slightly as if weighing his words, and then she looked back at the stars. They stayed there together, watching the slow drift of distant light, the quiet hum of the station filling the space between them. There was no declaration, no sudden leap into something they were not ready to name. Instead, there was the steady presence of two people who had seen each other's pain and chosen not to turn away from it. That choice was enough for now. It was more than enough. When they finally parted, it was with another nod, one that carried a promise not spoken, but understood, that whatever came next in this fragile peace, they would face it without the wall that had once stood between them. As Ryan walked away, he felt the strange lightness of knowing that an enemy had become something else, something unshaped and uncertain, yet unshakably real. Back in the medbay, Lura returned to her work, her hands moving with the same precision as always, but her thoughts drifting to the human soldier, who had once been nothing more than a symbol of loss and anger. She remembered the weight of his memories, the raw ache in his voice when he spoke of his friend, and the way he had stood beside her during the fight without hesitation. She had not expected to feel safer with him there, yet she had, and that truth was something she could not ignore. Far beyond the station, war still whispered, but inside these walls, it was silent. Here there was only the quiet beat of the present and the unspoken knowledge that something had been mended. Not perfectly, not fully, but enough to matter. The healing pod sat in the corner, powered down, awaiting its next use, its surface still faintly marked from the storm. No one would look at it and think of what it had done beyond the physical, but Ryan and Lura would always know. The pod had closed around two enemies and opened to something entirely different. It had not erased the past, but it had changed the way they carried it. And in a galaxy still scarred by conflict, that small change was a victory worth keeping. And so their story ended not with grand speeches or impossible promises, but with the quiet certainty that the line between hate and understanding was thinner than they had believed, and that in the right moment, even the deepest wounds could begin to heal. The end.